Hello, and welcome to Theology with Coffee. My name is Taylor Wood, and this is Casual Conversations about deep biblical truth. And this is a special episode that I'm going to be doing today. Just me. Kelson is not with me. But I wanted to do a special episode here over the holidays here at the end of 2023. And today's topic is to talk about the most important biblical empire that you've never heard of. The empire that we're going to be talking about is the Seleucid Empire. And again, you would be excused if you've never heard of this empire. The significance of this is, or rather, where this empire is located is it's between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's during a period of history that we call Second Temple period of history. And it's a period of history that Christians especially do not know much about, but it is vitally important to biblical history and to the development of theology moving into the New Testament. And the Seleucid Empire is right there in the middle of all of this. So to start this story, we actually need to go backwards a bit, and I need to talk about the Persian Empire. The Persians were a great empire that originally started as the Medo-Persian Empire, and many of you will know them from the end of the book of Daniel, where they conquer the Babylonians, and the Persians have really the largest and greatest empire in the ancient Near East at that time. And the land of Israel, the people of Israel, the Jews at that time, they are under the dominion of the Persians. Now, the Persian king Cyrus, he, through God's intervention, Cyrus has a very good relationship with the Jewish people, and he ends up issuing a decree in which the Jews return to Jerusalem, and Cyrus allows them to not only return to Jerusalem, but to end up, they are able to rebuild the wall and rebuild the temple. And this rebuilding the temple under the Persian Empire, this is what begins the Second Temple period of history. Now, right around the year, sometime in the 300s, around 330, another great empire rises to the scene. This is the Macedonian Empire, which is headed by Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, in what is a spectacular display of military genius, ends up defeating and really absorbing the entire Medo-Persian Empire. And as a result, the Macedonian Empire that Alexander the Great is the head of becomes the largest empire to date in the ancient Near East. And when the Persians are removed from power, it is now this Alexandrian the Great, or Alexander the Great's Alexandrian army that now takes control over the people of Israel and the land of Israel. Alexander the Great dies at a very young age, really in the middle of his military campaigns. And his kingdom is then divided up between four of his generals. Now, the two that we're really interested in, the first one is a general named Ptolemy, who takes over in the south. And the capital of the Ptolemaic Empire was in Alexandria, which is in modern-day Egypt. And this is really the center of Ptolemaic influence. Initially, it's actually the Ptolemies who gain influence and control over the region of Judea, where now the Jews have been flourishing and thriving for some time after the edict of King Cyrus. And so immediately after this happens, the Ptolemies are actually the ones that gain influence over the Judean region. The second of the generals who takes over a portion of Alexander's army is the general Seleucus, and he is the founder of the Seleucid Empire, or the Seleucid Kingdom, which is the focus of this podcast today. Now, the Seleucid kingdom is centered north of Israel in modern-day Syria and parts of Turkey. Initially, this is where the Seleucid Empire is really focused. It's sort of the eastern branch of what used to be Alexander the Great's Macedonian. And even though they are not Greek, nevertheless, the Seleucid Empire, just like the Ptolemaic Empire, is very much interested in Hellenizing the world. Now, Hellenizing means means to make the world more Greek. That is, to introduce Greek culture, Greek religion, Greek ways of thinking, Greek philosophy across the ancient Near East. And the Seleucids are very much involved in this process of Hellenizing the ancient Near East during this time. They grow, they become dominant, they become very, very powerful. Now, let's take a break talking about the Seleucids for just a moment. Let's return to the people of Israel and what's going on inside of Judea for just a minute here. Inside of Judea, essentially what happens is when the Persian Empire allows the Jews to come back into their homeland, they enter into their homeland and they are able to rebuild the wall, rebuild the temple, and establish somewhat of a authority in that region. But they are not an independent state. Through this entire time, they're always owned by someone. Nevertheless, the high priest develops quite a bit of influence over Israelite culture at that time. Essentially, what we see in Israel is what's called a cohenocracy, which is a government centered around the priesthood in which the high priest acts effectively as the chief administrator, the head of the executive branch, if you will, of the ancient Jewish culture and nation at this time. Now, these high priests that develop initially are very, very orthodox, very much interested in returning Israel to its roots in the Torah and worship of Yahweh. But over time, pressure from the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid empires to their north and to the south end up putting a lot of influence on the cohenocracy, a lot of influence on the priests to appease the Greek states that are technically their overlords. As a result, the Jews begin more and more adopting Hellenistic culture, Greek culture, and really in an attempt to try to endear themselves to these more powerful factions that are around. Now, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies are bitter enemies. And they fight a series of different wars. In fact, it's about a half a dozen wars over the course of a couple hundred years between the two of them. And Jerusalem and Judea sit right between these two massive empires. So as you can imagine, the ownership of the land of Judea becomes very important because that essentially provides access to these two rival empires. And so they're constantly fighting back and forth over this. Now, as we turn our attention back to the Seleucids, there's two kings of the Seleucid Empire in particular that I want to focus on. The first one is Antiochus III, or Antiochus the Great. Now, Antiochus III, really more than any other of the Seleucid kings, he goes a long way towards growing and expanding the Seleucid Empire. In fact, the Seleucid Empire, under the influence of Antiochus III, has so many successful military campaigns that they begin to look a lot like the Assyrian, the Babylonian, the Persian empires of old. Antiochus III, of course, goes to war with the Ptolemies in Egypt and has a number of successes. And one of the primary successes that he has is he's able to conquer Judea away from the Ptolemies. And Antiochus III, or Antiochus the Great, really becomes the dominant king over the Israelite people during this period of time. Now, surprisingly, Antiochus III actually has a really friendly relationship with Israel. He is a great patron of Jerusalem. His sort of philosophy of foreign policy is to continue a policy of live and let live of the Persians before, a policy of allowing a lot of religious freedom. And however, he is also actively supporting the growth of Hellenization in these cultures. And he really does a lot. He pays for a lot. He invests a lot in Jerusalem, and so he's actually quite popular among the ruling class of priests in Israel at that time. Now, as his kingdom is expanding, the Seleucid Empire is really set to become the next superpower of the ancient world until they run into a bit of a problem. And that problem is the now nascent state of Rome. That's right, Rome at this point has now become a player on the Mediterranean Sea scene. And even though Rome is not anywhere near as powerful and as dominant as what they're going to be during the time of the New Testament in Jesus' lifetime and the lifetime of the early church, nevertheless, Rome is gaining in influence and Rome is gaining in military strength. And Rome has a vested interest in trying to stop the growth of the Seleucid Empire and stop the Seleucids from becoming the next world power. And so they actually go to war with Antiochus the Great and they defeat him in a series of battles. Eventually, Antiochus the Great is embarrassed and he has to sign a treaty called the Treaty of Lampeia with the Romans, in which his conquest and his expansion is put to a stop by the Roman Republic, and the Seleucid Empire stops its expansion at that point. Now, a very important part of this treaty that he signs with Rome to essentially end the conflict with Rome is he has to provide one of his sons as a hostage in Rome. This is the way that many ancient treaties would work when you had two nations that were going to war with one another. In order to guarantee that the terms of a treaty were kept, oftentimes the losing party would have to send a member of the royal court to Rome or to the other nation as a hostage to provide collateral in case they don't follow the terms of that agreement. And of course, it is, and so Antiochus III sends his son, Antiochus IV, to Rome as this hostage. Now, eventually, Antiochus III dies, and his son, who is another Seleucus, takes over. But his son, and whenever his son takes over, his son then sends his own son, which would be the grandson of Antiochus III, to Rome as a hostage in order to return his brother, Antiochus IV. On Antiochus IV's trip back, there is an assassination that is made against Seleucus, his brother. And conspiring with kings from the region of Pergamum, which is in Turkey, it is Antiochus IV who is then placed on the throne of the Seleucid Empire. And Antiochus IV is the next really important king we need to talk about. Now, it's unclear historically to what degree Antiochus IV is involved in the assassination of his brother and his ascent to the throne, but no doubt he had some role to play in this. And he is your sort of stereotypical, egotistical, ego-driven mad king. He gives himself the name Antiochus Epiphanes, which means Antiochus God Manifest. But his contemporary enemies called him Antiochus Epimenes, which means Antiochus the Mad. And indeed, this is sort of the role that he plays, is of this mad, crazy, egotistical tyrant. Antiochus IV is now interested in restarting the campaigns and the expansions of his father, Antiochus the Great, from a generation before. And so this new Antiochus, Antiochus IV, once again begins these military campaigns and proclaims war on the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt once again. Now, let's hit pause on the Seleucids for a second. Let's go back to Jerusalem because the history here is so intertied with one another. At this time, Jerusalem has a high priest whose name is Jason, and Jason essentially rose to the rank of high priest by giving a series of bribes to the Seleucids in order to secure his position. But he has a rival, a man by the name of Menelaus. Now, both Menelaus and Jason are Hellenizers. In other words, they are interested not in preserving the traditions of the Old Testament, not in preserving the worship of Yahweh, but instead they are interested in moving Israel and Jerusalem into this new age of worshiping the Greek gods and adopting Greek culture. Jason is very much invested in this. Menelaus is even more so. And Menelaus gives a series of bribes to Antiochus IV, and he actually takes takes position through the patronage of Antiochus IV. He actually takes position as the head of the priesthood, the high priest there in Jerusalem. And part of what he does is he now makes it illegal to worship Yahweh. And he fully embraces this Hellenization of Jerusalem. And so this is what the people. Now, some of the priests are still loyal to Yahweh. Some of the priests in Israel are still loyal to the Torah. But the center of authority there in that land are very much devoted towards Hellenization and the getting rid of the old worship of God and Yahweh of the Old Testament. Now, back to Antiochus the Fourth. He begins these series of campaigns of conquering the Ptolemies, and he really wipes the map with them. The Ptolemies cannot stand up against Antiochus IV. He conquers stronghold after stronghold, marches right into Egypt, and actually besieges Alexandria, the center of Ptolemaic power. It looks as if Antiochus IV is about to seize Alexandria, and the Seleucid Empire is going to become the next Babylon, the next Assyria, the next Persia, the next superpower in the ancient Near East, until their old enemy, the Romans, show up once again. You see, the Romans, while they're not conquering the East yet, they are very interested in keeping a balance of power. They don't want to see a superpower arise in the East. And so they don't want the Ptolemies or the Seleucids to become too powerful. And Antiochus IV is becoming too powerful. So the Romans send a single senator and a small retinue of soldiers to go and meet Antiochus IV outside of the city of Jerusalem. When the senator arrives, the story goes that Antiochus offers a hand of friendship to him, and the senator refuses to shake his hand. Instead, he gives them a decree from Rome that basically says, take your armies, leave Egypt, leave Alexandria, end this war, or Rome is going to come and Rome is going to declare war against you. Now, at this point, Antiochus IV is incensed, but he is also very fearful because remember, it's the Romans who defeated his father and ended his father's expansion of the Seleucid Empire. He asked the Roman senator for a day to think about it, and famously, the Roman senator takes his walking stick, he draws a circle around Antiochus IV, and he says, until you must give me a decision before you leave this circle. Antiochus IV, unwilling to call down the wrath of Rome, says, fine, I will end my war. And utterly embarrassed, utterly defeated, even though the Romans never had to draw a single blade, nevertheless, his entire army is turned back, and Antiochus picks up his army and he goes back north to his capital of Antioch. Now, remember the geography of this region. For Antiochus to get back to Antioch from Egypt to Syria, he has to travel through, you guessed it, Judea and Jerusalem. In the meantime, while he's away, the Jason, if you remember him, he used this as an excuse to wage a coup against Menelaus. And Jason retakes the high priesthood in Jerusalem. And so Antiochus, who has just been embarrassed by the Romans, is already in a bad mood. He comes back and finds out that Jerusalem has essentially revolted against his rule. He's not happy about it. So he takes out all of his anger, all of his wrath upon Jerusalem. This sparks a bloody and violent time in Israel's history. Antiochus comes into Jerusalem. He murders thousands of people. He makes holding a Torah illegal. You cannot even own a Torah or read a Torah. He erects a idol to Zeus inside the temple, and then he builds a statue of himself and demands that all Jews offer sacrifices to this image of himself as God manifest. The worst part of all of this is he takes a pig into the temple and he sacrifices this pig, which is an unclean animal, inside the temple to this statue of Zeus. This is something that hundreds of years before, during the lifetime of Daniel, Daniel actually prophesied would happen. And if you want to know more about this, you can read Daniel chapter 9, Daniel chapter 11, and Daniel chapter 12. Daniel actually calls this the abomination of desolation when Antiochus IV, Antiochus, God manifest, Antiochus the Mad, this mad tyrant, does this and he sacrifices this pig. But this isn't the worst of what he does. He ends up, any mother who circumcises her child, he executes the mother as well as his children. He enslaves and murders thousands of Jews, and he leaves and he erects a gigantic fortress inside Jerusalem and leaves it in complete ruins as he goes back to Antioch to brood over his loss to the Romans. Now, at this point, Antiochus IV and his interaction with Jerusalem actually ends. Antiochus IV ends up, through a series of different events, he ends up losing the throne, and then there's this massive power struggle after his death on who is going to get the throne after him. And in the midst of this power struggle, there are governors that he leaves in charge of Jerusalem. The governors, they come in and they essentially remove all ability for the Jews to worship Yahweh. And at this point, there is a faction of essentially zealots, revolters, under the influence of a priest named Matthias and his son Judas Maccabeus, who turn around and they attack the Syrians. And this begins the great Jewish war of independence against the Seleucid Empire. This war takes place for about 3 to 5 years in the 160s. And miraculously, the Jews actually win their independence. They actually defeat the Seleucids through a series of guerrilla battles and guerrilla warfare and drive the Seleucids out. The Seleucids at this point, Antiochus IV is no more, and there's a power struggle, and so there's the Jews are able to take advantage of this power struggle that's going on in the Seleucid kingdom to really gain their own independence. However, remember, they're going up against a superpower. So at any point, the Seleucids can march in and retake Jerusalem. This is when the new priesthood, the Hasmonean priesthood, which is now this very orthodox priesthood, now makes the move to protect themselves from the Seleucids by signing a treaty with Seleucid's old enemy, you guessed it, Rome. And this is a bit of I think a step of historical irony here, because it is really this treaty with Rome. Essentially, Rome says, okay, Israel, you can operate as an independent state under our protection, and if the Seleucids come back, we will go and attack the Seleucids. That's essentially what Rome says. But the Jews become their own independent kingdom for the first time since the Babylonian captivity, hundreds of years earlier. The irony of this whole event is, of course, as you know, by the time we get to the New Testament, about 160 years after this, the Romans are going to be the oppressor. And eventually it will be the Romans who put a final end to the Jewish presence in Judea, first in 70 AD when they destroy the temple, and later in about 120 whenever they destroy Jerusalem and deport all the Jewish people. But at least at this time, in the 160s, Rome becomes the Jews' biggest ally, because essentially Rome is acting as a big iron door to keep the Seleucid Empire out of Israel. Now, the Seleucids would continue on for another 100 years after this, but steadily their influence would decline as a number of civil wars and power struggles leave them as a shell of their former glory. Eventually, they come in conflict with a number of different nations that they cannot fight. The Armenians and the Pontus empires both end up heavily damaging what the Seleucids are able to do, and eventually the Roman general Pompey in about 65 AD walks in and he conquers the Seleucids, and what was the Seleucid kingdom, what was almost a superpower in the ancient Near East, now becomes a part of the growing Roman Empire at this time. This is also about the time when the Jews lose their independence, also in 63 AD, when Pompey, the same Roman general, comes in and essentially removes the independence of Jerusalem and makes them a province within the growing Roman Empire. So that kind of gives you the history there. Why don't we ever talk about the Seleucids, and why are the Seleucids not well known? Well, first of all, the Seleucids aren't well known, and the primary reason for this is they show up in a history of biblical history that a lot of people just aren't aware of. Many Christians, they know the period of the Old Testament. In particular, they have a pretty strong idea of what happens from Israel escaping from Egypt to Israel being allowed back into the Promised Land under the Persian Empire, because that's a majority of when the Old Testament, the history that the Old Testament is dealing with. And then a lot of Christians know about what's happening during the Roman Empire days, when you have Jesus in Nazareth and you have emperors like Augustus and Tiberius and later Nero, who is a persecutor of Christians. But a lot of Christians today have no idea what's taking place during this classical period, during this period after Alexander the Great and before the Roman Empire really becomes the superpower as we understand it today. The part of history, the other reason why a lot of Christians don't really know about this is a lot of the part of history that deals with this is, again, the Second Temple literature. Second Temple literature includes books like First and Second Maccabees that details all the battles that I was telling you about there in Jerusalem. And a lot of Christians just don't bother reading books like this, even though they're very valuable. Now, why should you care? And why is the Seleucid Empire and Antiochus IV in particular very important? Well, I already mentioned the prophet Daniel. Daniel, in a stunning display of prophetic foresight, Daniel is able to tell us about all these conflicts that are going to take place between the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic kingdoms in great detail in Daniel chapter 11. Daniel also prefigures the rise of the Seleucid kingdom, and indeed the Seleucid kingdom becomes a picture of what the Bible calls a beast. A beast is a human empire or a human kingdom that is completely and utterly opposed to the will of God. Many different kingdoms throughout history have fit this description, and certainly in biblical times, the Babylonian kingdom, the Assyrian kingdom, at times the Persian kingdom, and definitely the Seleucids fit the bill of this beast, this kingdom or this empire that is utterly opposed to the will of God. Daniel also tells us that at the head of these beasts, there will arise figures who are the leaders of these empires, and they are Satan's tools to cause chaos on this world, and these figures are opposed to God's will. And these figures become known in the Bible as antichrists. In fact, it is not an accident that Jesus in the Olivet Discourse, Paul in 2 Thessalonians, and John in the book of Revelation, as they are talking about who the Antichrist will be, they all reference back to Daniel, and they all reference back to Antiochus IV and the Seleucid Empire. So understand that Antiochus IV was not the Antichrist, but he was a Antichrist. He is a picture of what the Antichrist will be like. And he is a villain of the ancient world that the writers of the New Testament would have known very, very well and would have expected their readers to know very well. So as we continue our study of the book of Revelation, it will be helpful for you to understand what one of the original beasts and what one of the original antichrists of the ancient world looked like, because John is going to use this imagery, he's going to use these pictures as he develops what the great end times beast and antichrist will be like. I hope you enjoyed this short episode on the Seleucid Empire. Like and subscribe to our channels, and be sure to share this information with everyone you can. It's Christmas time here whenever I'm recording this, so happy holidays to all of you. And whether you're listening to this fairly soon or whether you're listening to this sometime in the distant future, God bless you, my friend. We'll see you later. Bye.